Okay, so good evening. As expected, no one actually came for this lecture since we had to postpone it with 1 day, and obviously the likelihood is very high that people will have something better to do on a Friday evening than to read Greek. But I'm going to record this lecture anyway, and then you can view it afterwards. And then after this lecture, we're gonna I go through the today's chapter, the textbook, fast as well, just a quick translation. So let's start with the lecture. Let me share the screen first. So, welcome to lecture 6 of my classical Greek introductory course. Today, we are going to return to the first declension nouns, and more specifically to the masculine variants of these. You find a paradigm for the declension of nouns of this type on page 42, section 4.8 in the Cambridge Grammar of Classical Greek. After this, we're going to learn the imperfect forms of thematic verbs. Today we are going to look at both the active and the medio-passive thematic imperfect verb forms. The paradigms for these you find in the upper left-hand corner of the tables on pages 129 and 130 in the Cambridge Grammar. The imperfect forms are presented directly under the present indicative forms in those tables. Then we're also going to look at the inflection of the adjective polis, which means great or many. You can find the paradigms of this adjective on page 68, section 513 in Cambridge Grammar. And finally, we have some new syntax to round up the lecture. But let us turn to the first topic of today, the masculine nouns in the first declension. In the plural, nouns of this type are inflected exactly in the same way as feminine nouns in the same declension. The masculine nouns in the first declension can be divided into two overarching categories: those ending in es and those ending in as in the nominative singular. Here, as is the case with feminine nouns in the first declension, the rule is that the ending as is applied when the preceding letter is either an epsilon, an iota, or a rho, whereas the ending es is in place when the preceding letter is some other. We can see this clearly in the two example nouns on the screen. In the masculine noun neanias, which means youth, the letter preceding the ending is an iota, and therefore the noun gets a long a sound in the ending. Whereas in nautes, which means sailor, the preceding letter is not an epsilon, an iota, or a rho, and therefore the ending has a long a sound instead. Now, in the plural, nouns of this type are inflected exactly in the same way as feminine nouns in the same declension. If we look at the paradigms for the inflection of the plural forms of these nouns first, we can see that they are actually identical with regard to their endings when compared to the feminine nouns in the first declension as well. So for youth, we have here neaniai in the nominative, neanion in the genitive, neaniais in the dative, neanias in the accusative, and neaniai in the vocative. And for sailor, we have nautai in the nominative, nauton in the genitive, nautais in the dative, nautas in the accusative, and nautai in the vocative. So we may note here that the concluding alpha in the accusative plural is long, just like in the feminine words in the first declension, although I haven't marked the length of the vowel. Another rule that can be good to keep in mind is that in the genitive plural forms, the accent is always a circumflex, and it's always placed above the concluding omega in the last syllable. Actually, this rule applies to all nouns in the first declension, whether they are masculine or feminine. Okay, but let us turn to the singular forms of these words. Here we have neanias in the nominative, neaniu in the genitive, neania with the iota subscript in the dative, neanian in the accusative, and neania with the short concluding alpha in the vocative. In the other example, we have nautes in the nominative, nautu in the genitive, naute in the dative, again with the iota subscript, and nauten in the accusative, and nauta also with the short alpha ending, which this short alpha ending also causes the change of accent from an acute to a circumflex in the vocative. Now, the big difference in the inflection between masculine and feminine nouns, as far as the first declension goes, is found in some of the endings in the singular cases. Particularly, the singular nominative, genitive, and vocative forms look different. As you can see, if you go back and compare with the paradigms for feminine nouns in the first declension, which we looked at during lecture 3. But let us turn to verbs then. And first of all, we can ask what an imperfect form is. The imperfect describes a past action which has not been completed. So, for instance, in the English sentence, I was looking through the window and saw a cat. The word looking represents an imperfect. That is, the looking was something I did in the past, and as far as the information contained in the sentence goes, I never finished this looking action. So the difference between the present and the imperfect is actually just that the one takes place in the present and the other in the past. But in their respective time zones, they are both still ongoing. In English, there are no specific forms for the imperfect, whereas in some other Central Modern European languages, like in French, they exist. And this is also the case in Classical Greek. So to gain an understanding of how the imperfect verb forms are formed in Greek, we can begin by looking at how the first person singular of our paradigmatic example, paideuo, looks like in the imperfect. Here we have epaideuon, which would literally mean I was educating. So what are the components here that allow us to recognize the verb as an imperfect? Well, first of all, we have the root, the root paideo, and actually the stem or root is the same in present and in imperfect forms for any verb. And well, then we have this specific imperfect ending, and this in turn is different than the ones in the present tense. And this ending is on for imperfects in the first person singular. And finally, the imperfect usually also takes an augment, which is this epsilon preceding the root or the stem. And what is this augment? The augment is a prefix which in classical Greek is added to finite verb forms used to describe past time. And the imperfect forms counts among these verbs. Other verb forms that take an augment are the aorist indicative and the pluperfect, but this we will learn later. Okay, next we will learn a bit more about how verbs are augmented. Actually, the rule here is quite simple when the root of the augmented verb begins with a consonant. Since in these cases, like in the imperfect forms of paideo or lego that we see here, the augment consists simply of an epsilon, so that we get a paideon and a legon respectively. It gets somewhat more complicated, however, when the augmented verb has a stem beginning with the vowel, because in these cases there is a contraction between the augment and the initial vowel of the root, which means that these two vowels are drawn together. And from this contraction between the short a sound of the augment and the vowel or diphthong that forms the beginning of the verb root, a long vowel or a diphthong then emerges. Often this long vowel turns out to be an eta. For example, in the imperfect forms of the verb akuo, I hear. Here, the epsilon of the augment combines with the initial alpha of the stem to form the letter e. And hence we get ekuon as the first person singular imperfect form of this verb. I was hearing. In the same way, estio, I eat, becomes estion in the imperfect. But if the verb stem begins with some other vowel than an alpha or an epsilon, the vowel is usually lengthened when augmented. For instance, hoplitso, I arm, becomes hoplitso in the imperfect, and iketeuo becomes iketeuon with a long iota in the beginning. However, if the verb stems begins with a long vowel, for instance an eta, the long vowel stays unchanged when augmented. Then there are also some apparently irregular augmentations of verbs, which you can read about on page 122, section 1140 in the Cambridge Grammar. For instance, the imperfect form of echo, I have, which is eichon. Okay, there is one more thing we need to learn about augments, and this is how the augmentation of verbs works when the augmented verb is of a compound kind. That is, of a kind which is composed of a so-called prepositional prefix together with the actual verb. These kinds of compound verbs have been very common in Greek language throughout the ages. As examples, we can take the verb eis ago, formed of the preposition eis and the verb ago, which means I lead in. And another example is hypomeno, of hypo and the verb meno, meaning I stay behind. In these cases, the augment usually falls between the prepositional prefix and the actual verb, so that we get eis egon and hypomenon as the respective first-person singular imperfect forms. In the latter case, we may note that the concluding omicron in the prepositional prefix hypo is simply obliterated when the verb is augmented. This is indeed often the case if the preposition ends with the vowel. However, if the prepositional part of the composite verb is formed by the preposition peri or pro, this kind of obliteration does not occur. Thus, for instance, the imperfect of proballo, I throw before, or I propose, is pro e ballo. Fine. Let's turn to the paradigm for the inflection of the active imperfect then. So, here we have epaideuon in the first person singular, epaideues in the second person singular, epaideuen with the new effelkystikon in the third person singular, epaideuomen in the first person plural, epaideuete in the second person plural, and epaideuon in the third person plural. You may note here that the third person singular form is identical with the first person singular form is identical with the third person plural form. And this means that they can both mean I was educating or they were educating. So only based on the context are we able to determine which of these we actually have in the sentence. But let's move directly to the next paradigm, which is the medio-passive imperfect forms. Here we have epaideuomen in the first person singular, epaideu in the second person singular, epaideueto in the third person singular, epaideuometa in the first person plural, epaideueste in the second person plural, and epaideuonto in the third person plural. If you could memorize these two paradigms, that would be great. Fine. Last topic, or actually the last topic in the formal part of today. Then we have still some syntax to come. But the last forms for today is the inflection of the adjective polis, polle, poli, which bears the meaning of great or many. This is an adjective which actually contains two Greek declension. And one of these is the third declension, which we haven't learned yet, but we begin with it now. So let's go through these forms quickly then. If you start with the singular, we have here in the masculine, polis, pollu, pollo, pollin, and polis. And in the feminine, polle, polles, polle, pollen, and polle. And in the neuter, poli, pollu, pollo, poli, and poli. And then the plural forms are in the masculine, polloi, pollon, pollois, pollus, and polloi. And then the feminine is pollai, pollon, pollais, pollas, and the neuter is polla, pollon, pollois, polla. Okay, now we have the last topics of today, which are two final syntactical notes. The first of these concerns the use of the genitive. In our text so far, we have mainly encountered two different uses of the genitive. The possessive or attributive genitive, which is the most common use, but then we have also encountered the genitive as an object. For instance, after certain verbs. For instance, akuo, I hear, takes an genitive object in Greek. A third common use of the genitive is that of the partitive genitive, which we find in the phrase olloi ton anthropon, which means many of the men. Here, the masculine genitive plural ton anthropon of the men gives expression to the whole of which the so-called head word forms a part. This head is here represented by the adjective form in the masculine nominative, polloi, many. Okay, so finally, we will also encounter in the next chapter of our textbook so-called consecutive subordinate clauses, which give expression to a result of an action or of a circumstance. And this action or circumstance in turn has been presented in the main clause. These kinds of subordinate clauses, consecutive subordinate clauses, are typically introduced with the conjunction hoste, which means so that. And they are then followed either by a finite verb in the indicative mood or by an infinitive. We have encountered an example of a subordinate clause introduced with hoste and constructed with finite verbs in the indicative before. And when the consecutive clause has a finite verb in the indicative, like this, the depicted result is usually presented as something factual. As for example, in the sentence we have translated in our textbook, he selene lampei poste kai ge kai falatta leukai fainontai. The moon shines so that both the land and the sea appear white. But it is possible as well to construct these kinds of consecutive clauses with a verb in the infinitive, in which case the action in the subordinate clause is presented more like an intended result, as for example in the sentence echo triereis hoste peugein, which translates as I have 3 rams so that I can flee. So in a sentence like this, the infinitive of the subordinate clause actually functions like a predicate, or like a predicate and subject combination, which I have said that they normally do not do. Okay, so that was the lecture for today. So I said that we were going to go through the chapter in our textbook as well that you had for homework, but since no one was attending today due to the unfortunate circumstance that the lecture had to be postponed, and it's Friday night, I think it's a better idea that if you like, you can send the translations to me of this chapter, or you can also book a time with me so we can look at it together through Skype whenever you like, and whenever, of course, I'm free. Usually, it's possible for me in the evenings to give extra tutoring. So, if you like to do this, if you like to translate this chapter or some of the preceding ones together with me, just contact me through email and we can arrange a time. Otherwise, I wish you a pleasant weekend, and I hope to see you again next Thursday when we are going to be back on the normal schedule of the course. So thank you very much for this, and hope to see you. Bye.